Hello, U.S. History students, and welcome to Unit 2, Lesson 1, The Rise of the Progressive Era. The United States enters the Progressive Era in approximately 1890, and if you recall, this is still within the time period of the Gilded Age. The two eras actually do have some overlap. The Gilded Age was from about the 1870s until around 1910, and the Progressive Era picks up in about 1890 and goes until about 1920. And the purpose of the Progressive Era is to fix the problems that were presented and created during the Gilded Age. One of the main things during the Gilded Age was industrialization. The rise of machines and all of this wonderful new technology. Well, the rise of industrialization leads to urbanization, or the growth of cities, increased immigration because there's more pull factors. There are more things that are bringing and pulling these immigrants to the United States for a better life. We see the rise of poverty and also a lot of really dangerous working conditions that are causing more harm than they are good. During the Gilded Age, we also see the rise of city, state, and federal governments that are corrupt. These are your political machines like Tammany Hall, where they're essentially bribing people to get votes so they can stay in power. And also the era of patronage, where you get a job because of who you know, not because of what you can actually do. And then, of course, the rise of monopolies. Your robber barons like Carnegie and Rockefeller and Morgan, who are taking over either through vertical or horizontal integration the companies to where it's one person or company that controls all of an industry. Because of this, they're limiting competition in the economy and workers' wages, which ends up leading to some very bad economic issues within the nation. In the 1880s, a lot of middle-class Protestant Christians embrace what we consider the social gospel movement. And the social gospel movement essentially teaches these people that in order to properly honor God, they must help others and help change or reform society to make things better. The first place that a lot of the reformers are going to begin to try to make change is in the cities, like New York, Philadelphia, Chicago. And this is all in response to the slums and the tenement apartments like those at 97 Orchard Street that we had previously discussed, where there are multiple people, 8, 9, sometimes 10 people living in a small 3-room apartment. Child labor, alcohol abuse, prostitution, political corruption. These are all these really bad things in the cities that reformers are wanting to change. One of the early reformers was a lady by the name of Jane Addams. You can see her down in the bottom left corner of the screen. And she creates a place called Hull House in Chicago. And Hull House was one of the first settlement houses in the nation. And what this does is it offers a place for people, poor people or immigrants or people that are just down on their luck to come, and they'll give them baths, offer them cheap food. They would take care of their children while they would go to work. Job training so they could have a specialization and maybe make a little bit more money to help their family. And then also health care. During this time period, we do see some medical innovations and medicine is getting better, but a lot of the people, just regular people in the nation, cannot afford the medicines that are going to help them. And Hull House actually offers that at an affordable rate, if not free, to help get them better so they can help reform society. And all of her efforts and her successes with Hull House actually inspire reformers in other cities to build settlement houses of their own to assist the poor in their own cities, which helps to make society better across the country. A lot of the urban reformers also seek to improve the lives of workers and children. Remember, urban is just another word for city. And one of the ways that these urban reformers are going to try to do that is through a couple of organizations that we're probably really familiar with now. One of those is the YMCA. This organization created gyms and libraries to help young men and children to be able to work out and get an education because they can read books and have a place to go at a time when leisure time or time to themselves is becoming more and more common. The other of these organizations is the Salvation Army. And this organization created nurseries and soup kitchens to help people with child care. For example, a nursery would be a place where you could take your child and have somebody there to take care of them while you go to work and you don't have to worry about your child. But also a soup kitchen so that you could maybe have a meal for a day where you wouldn't otherwise be able to eat. And guys, the Salvation Army is the people at Christmas that stand outside the stores and ring the bells and you put the change or the money in the little kettle. These are two organizations that you may not really think about much, but they're very prevalent in 21st century society. One of the reformers that was helping do a lot of this was a lady by the name of Florence Kelley, and this is her photograph. And her big things were fighting child labor laws. She believed that children should not have to work until they are a certain age. And she fights for this until well into the 1930s before she actually succeeds in banning child labor. She also believes that women should be limited to a 10-hour workday. So she fought for a lot of women's rights, but she also fought for a lot of civil rights issues and worked alongside the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and really fought for multiple civil rights organizations and causes. Another big issue that a lot of reformers saw was alcohol abuse. And many of them kind of believed that alcohol was the root of all evil. If they could ban alcohol, it would reduce corruption, it would reduce crime, it would help assimilate immigrants into American society and help them to be more like the American people. Because they saw a lot of the new immigrants, or the peoples that were coming from Southern or Eastern Europe, as coming from societies and communities where alcohol was very prevalent. So it was just kind of a part of their way of life. If we can ban the alcohol, maybe they would be more readily acceptable of American society and more ready to accept changing their lives to be more like the Americans. Because assimilation of immigrants at this time period was something that a lot of nativist people wanted. Remember, nativist is the belief that the people that are born in a country are better than the people that are coming to a country. Two very prominent women who fought for prohibition were Frances Willard and Carrie Nation. Carrie Nation actually is the woman in these pictures who has the axe, and she would go into bars and saloons and take her axe and just start breaking all the alcohol bottles to try to prevent the people from having alcohol. These two ladies led the Women's Christian Temperance Union, or the WCTU, and this organization fought for prohibition laws. And prohibition simply means a ban on alcohol. So in this concept, temperance and prohibition are two words that basically mean refraining from drinking alcohol or banning of drinking alcohol. So anytime you see temperance or prohibition, it means a ban on alcohol. A lot of these prohibition laws start to gain support in the rural areas and the states in the South and the West. So the states that are less populated or more out in the country start to gain more prohibition laws or more bans on alcohol, to the point where in 1919, the states ratified the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which outlaws alcohol throughout the country. Now, the 18th Amendment does not ban consumption, but it bans the sale and manufacture. So you cannot make it and you cannot sell it. If you can't make it and you can't sell it, you're not drinking it. But that's not to say people didn't still do that. In fact, as we see through the years, the 18th Amendment is the only amendment to the United States Constitution to ever be repealed or taken away. Basically, that means that the 18th Amendment eventually is overturned and people are allowed to buy, sell, and make alcohol again. But that's not until a little bit later. During this time period, we also see the rise of investigative journalists, and these people are known as muckrakers. Muckrakers exposed the corruption and the poverty and the health hazards, as well as the monopolies. Basically, they are the ones that are writing all of these articles and books and things like that that are exposing the issues, bringing these issues to the forefront of people's minds. One of the very prominent muckrakers of this era is a man by the name of Jacob Riis. Jacob Riis is a photojournalist, meaning instead of writing articles or writing books, he takes pictures. And so he takes all of these pictures of people living in tenements and children sleeping on the streets and things like that, and he puts them into a book that he titles How the Other Half Lives, and he publishes it. And people all over the country of all different walks of life can see basically how all of these people are living in these horrible conditions, and it just brings it to people's attention. Another one is a lady by the name of Ida Tarbell, and she's a person who writes a book to expose Rockefeller. Remember, Rockefeller is our oil monopoly guy. And she really does not agree with his business practices and doesn't agree with how monopolies are affecting the economy. And so she writes a book called The History of Standard Oil and then publishes it in 1904. And in her book, she basically writes everything down about Rockefeller's ruthless business practices, his paying the workers too little and things like that. And she advocates for breaking up monopolies and brings all of the issues of monopolies to the forefront of people's minds. And guys, during this time period, there's no social media. There's no Instagram. There's no Twitter. They're writing books to make people aware of the problems that are happening. They're publishing photos because this is the way that people get their news and get their information in the progressive era. A really big advocate for women's suffrage is Susan B. Anthony. Now, suffrage means the right to vote. So anytime you see the word suffrage, it's referring to the right to vote. Susan B. Anthony is a reformer and an abolitionist, meaning that she fought to end slavery before it was ended in 1865. And she leads the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which is an organization that was instrumental in organizing meetings of women across the country, including the very first one at Seneca Falls, New York, where the women are getting together and saying, we deserve the right to vote as well. Her efforts helped to motivate a lot of women to actually join the women's suffrage movement and fight for their right to vote for their leaders and vote for their laws. And all of her advocation and her hard work, among many, many other women, eventually leads to the passage of the 19th Amendment, which we are celebrating the centennial of in 2020. The 19th Amendment is another amendment that you must know, and it is the amendment that allows women the right to vote. And it is passed in 1920. Our next one is Ida B. Wells. She is also a journalist, which means she's a writer, and her platform is bringing attention to racial issues. She is an African American woman living in, a Jim Crow America where African Americans don't have the same rights as white people. And they're segregated, meaning they have to basically live their lives separate from white people. And a couple of things that she really focuses on is segregated schools. Because during this time period, white kids and black kids are not allowed to go to school together. They have to go to separate schools. Even if you are a black child who lives a couple of blocks away from a white school, sorry. During this time period, you can't go to that school. You have to go to the school across town because that's where the black school is. And it wasn't fair, and she fought to bring attention to that in hopes that she would be able to change it. She also brings attention to lynching. Lynching is the killing of someone, especially by hanging. Lynching is generally known as the brutal hanging of a person. And they do this because they believe that that person committed a crime, but they never put that person on trial. They just kill them. She believed that was extremely wrong. And a lot of times it was the African Americans that were being lynched because the white people would just assume that they caused something or they committed a crime. So they would just hang them and they wouldn't put them on trial. So she was trying to bring attention to that to try to get that to stop as well. She was one of the influential leaders who created the National Association of Colored Women in 1896 and then went on to be considered one of the founding members of the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Another very prominent muckraker in the progressive era is a man by the name of Upton Sinclair. Upton Sinclair wrote a book called The Jungle, and it was published in 1906. And in this book, he reveals the unsanitary condition of slaughterhouses which are where they would take the cattle, for example, to have them butchered so that they could have meat to sell to feed families. And he published how disgusting things were and how there were rats running around and it was dirty and it was unclean and unsanitary. And the book is disgusting. This led the government to finally take notice of this and say, we have to have food regulation in our country. We have to make this food safe to eat. While the novel does not result in worker reforms, which is what Sinclair really wanted, it does cause the government to really look at things and start investigating. And it leads to the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act. The Pure Food and Drug Act is the act that makes it illegal for a company not to tell you what's in your food or your medicine. That's why we have labels that tell us what's in everything. And the Meat Inspection Act is where they have to send inspectors, government inspectors, into these meat packing plants to make sure that everything is clean and everything is sanitary, to make sure that that food is good for people to eat. Now I want to play this video for you that might give you a little bit more background or a little bit more understanding of Mr. Sinclair.
Sinclair used the horrors he witnessed as the basis for Jurgis's fictionalized story. As Jurgis discovers, work in the plant involves back-breaking labor in unsafe conditions. When a worker becomes ill or gets injured, he's cast aside, and hundreds of jobless men fight to replace him. Workers in the pickling room have their fingers eaten by acid. Cooks live in danger of falling into open vats of boiling meat.
It was live or die, sink or swim. So the deadened conditions in the slaughtering house and that death that also permeated the battle between the owners and the workers.
It created this traditional, naturalistic, deterministic story in which human beings, just like the animals that are pulled up the chute of the packing plants, and they are pulled up with this sense of optimism at the beginning, this idea of going to America, becoming successful, leaving behind the problems of Europe, and then they go down just like the animals, and they are processed too.
When The Jungle was published, there was a public outcry. Americans were outraged, and they urged the United States Congress to pass the Meat Inspection Act of 1906. More federal laws followed that prevented packers from adding fillers and impurities to meat. And United States Department of Agriculture inspectors were put in every meat plant in the country. This wasn't the reaction that Sinclair was looking for. He wanted to help the workers. I aimed at the public's heart, he wrote, and by accident, I hit it in the stomach. It took decades to improve the working conditions Sinclair criticized in The Jungle. The changes came from inside the factories themselves, from members of labor unions making demands of the factory owners. The Jungle's pro-worker viewpoint may have been lost on the public at the time, but its powerful message is clear today.
It was a microcosm, a look at the 20th century as it was unfolding and all the different battle lines between the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots. And in that sense, it's an enduring classic.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, that will do it for lesson 2.1, our first lesson of the progressive era. See you back here for lesson 2.2. Have a great day.